The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 2, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 11, Side 2. Friedrich, Lord of Peace, or Frederick I, 1152 to 1190, was 30 when chosen king. He was not imposing, a small, fair-skinned man with yellow hair and a red beard that won him in Italy the name of Barbarossa. But his head was clear and his will was strong. His life was spent in labors for the state, and though he suffered many defeats, he brought Germany again to the leadership of the Christian world. Carrying in his veins the blood of both the Hohenstaufens and the Welfs, he proclaimed a Landfried, or peace of the land, conciliated his enemies, quieted his friends, and sternly suppressed feuds, disorder, and crime. His contemporaries described him as genial and ever ready with a winning smile. But he was a terror to evildoers, and the barbarism of his penal laws advanced civilization in Germany. His private life was justly praised for decency. However, he divorced his first wife on grounds of consanguinity, and married the heiress of the Count of Burgundy, winning a kingdom with his bride. Anxious for papal coronation as emperor, he promised Pope Eugenius III aid against the rebellious Romans and the troublesome Normans in return for the imperial ointment. Arrived at Nepi, near Rome, the proud young king met the new pontiff, Hadrian IV, and omitted the customary rite by which the secular ruler held the pope's bridle and stirrup and helped him to dismount. Hadrian reached the ground unaided and refused Frederick the kiss of peace and the crown of empire until the traditional ritual should be performed. For 2 days the aides of pope and king disputed the point, hanging empire on protocol. Frederick yielded. The pope retired and made a second entry on horseback. Frederick held the papal bridle and stirrup and thereafter spoke of the Holy Roman Empire in the hope that the world would consider the emperor as well as the pope the vice-regent of God. His imperial title made him also king of Lombardy. No German ruler since Henry IV had taken this title literally, but Frederick now sent to each of the northern Italian cities a podesta to govern it in his name. Some cities accepted, some rejected, these alien masters. Loving order more than liberty, and perhaps anxious to control the Italian outlets of German trade with the East, Frederick set out in 1158 to subdue the rebellious towns, which loved liberty more than order. He summoned to his court at Roncaglia the learned legists who were reviving Roman law at Bologna. He was pleased to learn from them that by that law the emperor held absolute authority over all parts of the empire, owned all property in it, and might modify or abrogate private rights whenever he thought it desirable for the state. Pope Alexander III, fearing for the temporal rights of the papacy, and citing the donations of Pepin and Charlemagne, repudiated these claims, and, when Frederick insisted on them, excommunicated him in 1160. The cries of Guelph and Ghibelline now passed into Italy to denote respectively the supporters of the Pope and those of the Emperor. For 2 years Frederick besieged obdurate Milan. Capturing it at last, he burned it to the ground in 1162. Angered by this ruthlessness and galled by the exactions of the German podestas, Verona, Vicenza, Padua, Treviso, Ferrara, Mantua, Brescia, Bergamo, Cremona, Piacenza, Parma, Modena, Bologna, and Milan formed the Lombard League in 1167. At Legnano, in 1176, the troops of the League defeated Frederick's German army and forced him to a 6 years' truce. A year later, emperor and pope were reconciled, and at Constance Frederick signed in 1183 a treaty restoring self-government to the Italian cities. These, in return, recognized the formal suzerainty of the empire and magnanimously agreed to provision Frederick and his retinue on his visits to Lombardy. Defeated in Italy, Frederick triumphed everywhere else. He successfully asserted the imperial authority over Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary. He reasserted over the German clergy, in practice if not in words, all the rights of appointment that Henry IV had claimed, and won the support of that clergy even against the popes. Germany, glad to woo him from Italy, basked in the splendor of his power, and gloried in the nightly pageantry of his coronations, his marriages, and his festivals. In 1189 the old emperor led 100,000 men on the Third Crusade, perhaps hoping to unite East and West in a Roman Empire restored to its ancient scope. A year later he was drowned in Cilicia. Like Charlemagne, he had drunk too deeply of the Roman tradition. He had exhausted himself in the effort to revive a dead past. Admirers of monarchy mourned his defeats as victories for chaos. Devotees of democracy celebrate them as stages in the development of freedom. Within the limits of his vision he was justified. Germany and Italy were sinking into a licentious disorder. Only a strong imperial authority could put an end to feudal feuds and municipal wars. Order had to pave the way before a rational liberty could grow. In the later weakness of Germany, loving legends formed about Frederick I. What the 13th century imagined of his grandson was in time applied to Barbarossa. He was not really dead. He was only sleeping in the Kyffhauser mountain in Thuringia. His long beard could be seen growing through the marble that covered him. Some day he would wake up, shrug the earth from his shoulders, and make Germany again orderly and strong. When Bismarck forged a united Germany, a proud people saw in him Barbarossa risen triumphantly from the tomb. Henry VI, from 1190 to 1197, almost realized his father's dream. In 1194, with the help of Genoa and Pisa, he conquered southern Italy and Sicily from the Normans. All Italy but the Papal States submitted to him. Provence, Dauphiné, Burgundy, Alsace, Lorraine, Switzerland, Holland, Germany, Austria, Bohemia, Moravia, and Poland were united under Henry's rule. England acknowledged itself his vassal. The Almohad Moors of Africa sent him tribute. Antioch, Cilicia, and Cyprus asked to be included in the empire. Henry eyed France and Spain with unsated appetite and planned to conquer Byzantium. The first detachments of his army had already embarked for the east when Henry, aged 33, succumbed to dysentery in Sicily. He had made no provision for so ignominious a revenge by the climate of his conquest. His only son was a lad of 3. A decade of disorder ensued while would-be emperors fought for the throne. When Frederick II came of age, the war of empire and papacy was resumed. It was fought in Italy by a German-Norman monarch become Italian, and will be better viewed from the Italian scene. Another generation of turmoil followed the death of Frederick II in 1250. That herrenlose schreckliche Zeit, Schiller called it, that masterless, frightful age, in which the electoral princes sold the throne of Germany to any weakling who would leave them free to consolidate their independent power. When the chaos cleared, the Hohenstaufen dynasty had ended, and in 1273 Rudolf of Habsburg, making Vienna his capital, began a new line of kings. To win the imperial crown, Rudolf signed in 1279 a declaration recognizing the complete subordination of the royal to the papal power, and renouncing all claims to southern Italy and Sicily. Rudolf never became emperor, but his courage, devotion, and energy restored order and prosperity to Germany, and firmly established a dynasty that ruled Austria and Hungary till 1918. Henry VII, from 1308 to 1313, made a final effort to unite Germany and Italy. With scant support from the nobles of Germany and a small following of Walloon knights, he crossed the Alps in 1310, and was welcomed by many Lombard cities tired of class war and interurban strife, and anxious to throw off the political authority of the Church. Dante hailed the invader with a treatise on monarchy, boldly proclaiming the freedom of the secular from the spiritual power, and appealed to Henry to save Italy from papal domination. But the Florentine Guelphs won the upper hand. The turbulent cities withdrew their support, and Henry, surrounded with enemies, died of the malarial fever with which Italy now and then repays her importunate lovers. Turned back in the south by natural barriers of topography, race, and speech, Germany found outlet and recompense in the east. German and Dutch migration, conquest, and colonization reclaimed 3/5 of Germany from the Slavs. Fertile Germans expanded along the Danube into Hungary and Romania. German merchants organized fairs and outlets at Frankfurt on the Oder, Breslau, Prague, Krakow, Danzig, Riga, Dorpat, and Reval, and trading centers everywhere from the North Sea and the Baltic to the Alps and the Black Sea. The conquest was brutal. The results were an immense advance in the economic and cultural life of the border. Meanwhile, the absorption of the emperors in Italian affairs, the recurrent need of enlisting or rewarding the support of lords and knights with grants of land or power, and the weakening of the German monarchy by papal opposition and Lombard revolts, had left the nobility free to engross the countryside and reduce the peasantry to serfdom, and feudalism triumphed in 13th century Germany at the very time when it was succumbing to the royal power in France. The bishops, whom the earlier emperors had favored as a foil to the barons, had become a second nobility, as rich, powerful, and independent as the secular lords. By 1263, 7 nobles, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, the dukes of Saxony and Bavaria, the Count Palatine, and the Margrave of Brandenburg, had been entrusted by the feudality with the authority to choose the king, and these electors hedged in the powers of the ruler usurped royal prerogatives, and seized crown lands. They might have acted as a central government and given the nation unity. They did not. Between elections they went their several ways. No German nation existed yet. There were only Saxons, Swabians, Bavarians, Franks, etc. There was as yet no national parliament, but only territorial diets, or Landtage. A Reichstag, or Diet of the Commonwealth, established in 1247, languished feebly in the interregnum, and acquired prominence only in 1338. A corps of ministeriales, serfs or freedmen appointed by the king, provided a loose bureaucracy and continuity of government. No one capital centered the country's loyalty and interest. No one system of laws governed the realm. Despite the efforts of Barbarossa to impose Roman law upon all Germany, each region kept its own customs and code. In 1225, the laws of the Saxons were formulated in the Sachsenspiegel, or Saxon Mirror. In 1275, the Schwabenspiegel codified the laws and customs of Swabia. These codes asserted the ancient right of the people to choose their king, and of the peasants to keep their freedom and their land. Serfdom and slavery, said the Sachsenspiegel, are contrary to nature and the will of God, and owe their origin to force or fraud. But serfdom grew. The age of the Hohenstaufens, from 1138 to 1254, was the greatest age of Germany before Bismarck. The manners of the people were still crude, their laws chaotic, their morals half Christian, half pagan, and their Christianity half a cover for territorial robbery. Their wealth and comforts could not compare, city for city, with those of Flanders or Italy. But their peasantry was industrious and fertile, their merchants enterprising and adventurous, their aristocracy the most cultured and powerful in Europe, their kings the secular heads of the Western world, ruling a realm from the Rhine to the Vistula, from the Rhone to the Balkans, from the Baltic to the Danube, from the North Sea to Sicily. Out of a virile commercial life, 100 cities had taken form. Many of them had charters of self-government. Decade by decade they grew in wealth and art, until in the Renaissance they would be the pride and glory of Germany, and be mourned in our day as a beauty that has passed from the earth. 7. Scandinavia. After a century of happy obscurity, Denmark re-entered world history with Valdemar I, from 1157 to 1182. Helped by his minister Absalon, Archbishop of Lund, he organized a strong government, cleared his seas of pirates, and enriched Denmark by protecting and encouraging trade. In 1167, Absalon founded Copenhagen as a market haven, Kjøbenhavn. Valdemar II, from 1202 to 1241, replied to German aggression by conquering Holstein, Hamburg, and Germany northeast of the Elbe. For the honor of the Blessed Virgin, he undertook 3 crusades against the Baltic Slavs, captured northern Estonia, and founded Reval. In one of these campaigns he was attacked in his camp and escaped death, we are told, partly by his own valor, partly through the timely descent from heaven of a red banner bearing a white cross. This Dannebrog, or Dane's cloth, became thereafter the battle standard of the Danes. In 1223 he was taken prisoner by Count Henry of Schwerin, and was released after 2.5 years only on his surrendering to the Germans all his Germanic and Slav conquests, except Rügen. He devoted the remainder of his remarkable life to internal reforms and the codification of Danish law. At his death Denmark was double its present area, included southern Sweden, and had a population equal to that of Sweden, or 300,000, and Norway, or 200,000, combined. The power of the kings declined after Valdemar II, and in 1282 the nobles secured from Erik Glipping a charter recognizing their assembly, the Danehof, as a national parliament. Only the imaginative empathy of a great novelist could make us visualize the achievement of Scandinavia in these early centuries. The heroic conquest, day by day, foot by foot, of a difficult and dangerous peninsula. Life was still primitive. Hunting and fishing, as well as agriculture, were primary sources of sustenance. Vast forests had to be cleared, wild animals had to be brought under control, waters had to be channeled to productive courses, harbors had to be built, men had to harden themselves to cope with a nature that seemed to resent the intrusion of man. Cistercian monks played a noble role in this age-long war, cutting timber, tilling the soil, and teaching the peasants improved methods of agriculture. One of the many heroes of the war was Earl Birger, who served Sweden as prime minister from 1248 to 1266, abolished serfdom, established the reign of law, founded Stockholm circa 1255, and inaugurated the Folkung dynasty from 1250 to 1365 by putting his son Valdemar on the throne. Bergen grew rich as the outlet of Norway's trade, and Visby, on the island of Gotland, became the center of contact between Sweden and the Hanseatic League. Excellent churches were built, cathedral and monastic schools multiplied, poets strummed their lays, and Iceland, far off in the Arctic mists, became in the 13th century the most active literary center in the Scandinavian world. 8. England. 1. William the Conqueror. A masterly mixture of force, legality, piety, subtlety, and fraud. Elevated to the throne by a cowed witan, he swore to observe existing English law. Some thanes in the west and north took advantage of his absence in Normandy to try revolt in 1067. He returned and passed like a flame of revenge through the land and harried the north with such judicious killing and destruction of homes, barns, crops, and cattle that northern England did not fully recover till the 19th century. He distributed the choicest lands of the kingdom in great estates among his Norman aides, and encouraged these to build castles as fortresses of defense against a hostile population. He kept large tracts as crown lands. One parcel, 30 miles long, was set aside as a royal hunting preserve. All houses, churches, and schools therein were leveled to the ground to clear the way for horses and hounds, and any man who slew a hart or hind in this new forest was to lose his eyes. So was founded the new nobility of England, whose progeny still bear now and then French names. And the feudalism that before had been relatively weak covered the land and reduced most of the conquered people to serfdom. All the soil belonged to the king, but Englishmen who could show that they had not resisted the conquest were allowed to repurchase their lands from the state. To list and know his spoils, William sent agents in 1085 to record the ownership, condition, and contents of every parcel of land in England. And so narrowly did he commission them, says the old chronicle, that there was not a yard of land, nay, not even an ox, nor a cow, nor a swine, that was not set down in his writ. The result was the Doomsday Book, ominously so named as the final doom or judgment in all disputes of realty. To assure himself military support and limit the power of his great vassals, William summoned all important landowners of England, 60,000 of them, to a concourse at Salisbury in 1086, and made every man pledge his paramount fealty to the king. It was a wise precaution against the individualistic feudalism that was at that time dismembering France. One must expect a strong government after a conquest. William set up or deposed knights and earls, bishops and archbishops and abbots. He did not hesitate to jail great lords and to assert his right over ecclesiastical appointments against the same powerful Gregory VII, who was in these years bringing the Emperor Henry IV to Canossa. To prevent fires, he ordered a curfew, that is, a covering or extinction of hearth fires, and therefore in winter retirement to bed, by 8 p.m. for the people of England. To finance his spreading government and conquests, he laid heavy taxes upon all sales, imports, exports, and the use of bridges and roads. He restored the Danegeld, which Edward the Confessor had abolished. And when he learned that some Englishmen, to elude his fingers, had placed their money in monastic vaults, he had all monasteries searched and all such hoards removed to his own treasury. His royal court readily accepted bribes and honestly recorded them in the public register. It was frankly a government of conquerors resolved that the profits of their enterprise should be commensurate with its risks. The Norman clergy shared in the victory. The able and pliant Lanfranc was brought in from Caen and was made Archbishop of Canterbury and first minister to the king. He found the Anglo-Saxon clergy addicted to hunting, dicing, and marriage, and replaced them with Norman priests, bishops, and abbots. He drew up a new monastic constitution, the customs of Canterbury, and raised the mental and moral level of the English clergy. Probably at his suggestion, William decreed the separation of ecclesiastical from secular courts, ordered all spiritual matters to be submitted to the canon law of the Church, and pledged the state to enforce the penalties fixed by ecclesiastical tribunals. Tithes were levied upon the people for the support of the Church, but William required that no papal bull or letter should be given currency or force in England without his approval, and that no papal legate should enter England without the royal consent. The National Assembly of the Bishops of England, which had been part of the Witan, was hereafter to be a distinct body, and its decrees were to have no validity except when confirmed by the king. Like most great men, William found it easier to rule a kingdom than his family. The last 11 years of his life were clouded by quarrels with his Queen Matilda. His son Robert demanded full authority in Normandy. Denied this, he rebelled. William fought him indecisively and made peace by promising to bequeath the duchy to Robert. The king grew so stout that he could hardly mount a horse. He warred with Philip I of France over boundaries, When he tarried at Rouen, almost immovable with corpulence, Philip jested, it was said, that the King of England was lying in, and there would be a grand display of candles at his churching. William swore that he would indeed light many candles. He ordered his army to burn down Mantes and all its neighborhood, and to destroy all crops and fruits, and it was done. Riding happily amid the ruins, William was thrown against the iron pommel of his saddle by a stumble of his horse. He was carried to the priory of St. Gervas near Rouen. He confessed his sins in gross, and made his will, distributed his treasure penitently among the poor and to the church, and provided for the rebuilding of Mantes. All his sons except Henry deserted his deathbed to fight for the succession. His officers and servants fled with what spoils they could take. A rustic vassal bore his remains to the Abbé aux Hommes at Caen in 1087. The coffin made for him proved too small for his corpse. When the attendants tried to force the enormous bulk into the narrow space, the body burst and filled the church with a royal stench. The results of the Norman conquest were limitless. A new people and class were imposed upon the Danes, who had displaced the Anglo-Saxons, who had conquered the Roman Britons, who had mastered the Celts, etc. And centuries would elapse before the Anglo-Saxon and Celtic elements would reassert themselves in British blood and speech. The Normans were akin to the Danes, but in the century since Rollo they had become Frenchmen. And with their coming, the customs and speech of official England became for 3 centuries French. Feudalism was imported from France into England with its trappings, chivalry, heraldry, and vocabulary. Serfdom was more deeply and mercilessly imposed than ever in England before. The Jewish moneylenders who came in with William gave a new stimulus to English trade and industry. The closer connection with the continent brought to England many ideas in literature and art. Norman architecture achieved its greatest triumphs in Britain. The new nobility brought new manners, fresh vitality, a better organization of agriculture, and the Norman lords and bishops improved the administration of the state. The government was centralized. Though it was through despotism, the country was unified, life and property were made more secure, and England entered upon a long period of internal peace. She was never successfully invaded again. 2. Thomas à Becket. It is an adage in England that between 2 strong kings a weak king intervenes, but there is no limit to the number of intermediate middlings. After the Conqueror's death, his eldest son Robert received Normandy as a separate kingdom. A younger son, William Rufus, the Red, 1087 to 1100, was crowned King of England on promising good behavior to his anointer and minister Lanfranc. He ruled as a tyrant till 1093, fell sick, promised good behavior, recovered, and ruled as a tyrant till he was shot to death while hunting by an unknown hand. The saintly Anselm, who succeeded Lanfranc as Archbishop of Canterbury, withstood him patiently and was sent back to France. A third son of the Conqueror, Henry I, from 1100 to 1135, recalled Anselm. The prelate philosopher demanded an end to the royal election of bishops. Henry refused. After a tedious quarrel, it was agreed that English bishops and abbots were to be chosen by cathedral chapters or the monks in the presence of the king, and should do homage to him for their feudal possessions and powers. Henry loved money and hated waste. He taxed heavily, but governed providently and justly. He kept England in order and at peace, except that with one battle at Tinchebray in 1106, he restored Normandy to the British crown. He bade the nobles restrain themselves in dealing with the wives, sons, and daughters of their men. He himself had many illegitimate sons and daughters by various mistresses, but he had the grace and wisdom to marry Maud, scion of both the Scottish and pre-Norman English kings, thereby bringing old royal blood into the new royal line. In his last days, Henry made the barons and bishops swear fealty to his daughter Matilda and her young son, the future Henry II. But on the king's death, Stephen of Blois, grandson of the Conqueror, seized the throne, and England suffered 14 years of death and taxes in a civil war marked by the most horrible cruelties. Meanwhile, Henry II grew up, married Eleanor of Aquitaine and her duchy, invaded England, forced Stephen to recognize him as heir to the throne, and on Stephen's death became king in 1154. So ended the Norman and began the Plantagenet dynasty. Geoffrey of Anjou, father of Henry II, had worn a sprig or planta of the broom plant, in French genêt, in his hat. Henry was a man of strong temper, eager ambition, and proud intellect, half inclined to atheism. Nominally master of a realm that reached from Scotland to the Pyrenees, including half of France, he found himself apparently helpless in a feudal society where the great lords, armed with mercenaries and fortified in castles, had pulverized the state into baronies. With awesome energy, the youthful king gathered money and men, fought and subdued one lord after another, destroyed the feudal castles, and established order, security, justice, and peace. With a masterly economy of cost and force, he brought under English rule an Ireland conquered and despoiled by Welsh buccaneers. But this strong man, one of the greatest kings in England's history, was shattered and humbled by encountering in Thomas à Becket a will as inflexible as his own, and in religion a power then mightier than any state. Thomas was born in London about 1118, of middle-class Norman parentage. His precocious brilliance of mind caught the eye of Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, who sent him to Bologna and Auxerre to study civil and canon law. Returning to England, he entered orders and soon rose to be Archdeacon of Canterbury. But like so many churchmen of those centuries, he was a man of affairs rather than a clergyman. His interest and skill lay in administration and diplomacy, and he showed such ability in these fields that at the age of 37 he was made Secretary of State. For a time he and Henry accorded well. The handsome chancellor shared the intimacy and knightly sports, almost the wealth and power of the king. His table was the most sumptuous in England, and his charity to the poor was equaled by his hospitality to his friends. In war he led in person 700 knights, fought single combats, planned campaigns. When he was sent on a mission to Paris, his luxurious equipage of 8 chariots, 40 horses, and 200 attendants alarmed the French, who wondered how rich must be the king of so opulent a minister. In 1162 he was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. As if by some magic incantation, he now changed his ways abruptly and thoroughly. He gave up his stately palace, his royal raiment, his noble friends. He sent in his resignation as chancellor. He put on coarse garb, wore a haircloth next to his skin, lived on vegetables, grains, and water, and every night washed the feet of 13 beggars. He became now an unyielding defender of all the rights, privileges, and temporalities of the Church. Among these rights was the exemption of the clergy from trial by civil courts. Henry, who aspired to spread his rule over all classes, raged to find that crimes by the clergy often went unpunished by ecclesiastical courts. Assembling the knights and bishops of England at Clarendon in 1164, he persuaded them to sign the constitutions of Clarendon, which ended many clerical immunities. But Becket refused to put his archiepiscopal seal upon the documents. Henry promulgated the new laws nevertheless, and summoned the ailing prelate to trial at the royal court. Becket came and quietly withstood his own bishops, who joined in declaring him guilty of feudal disobedience to his suzerain the king. The court ordered his arrest. He announced that he would appeal the case to the Pope, and in his archiepiscopal robes, which none dared touch, he walked unharmed from the room. That evening he fed a great number of the poor in his London home. During the night he fled in disguise by devious routes to the Channel, crossed the turbulent strait in a frail vessel, and found haven in a monastery at St. Omer in the realm of the King of France. He submitted his resignation as archbishop to Pope Alexander III, who defended his stand, reinvested him with his see, but sent him for a time to live as a simple Cistercian monk in the abbey of Pontigny. Henry banished from England all of Becket's relatives of any age or sex. When Henry came to Normandy, Thomas left his cell, and from a pulpit at Vézelay pronounced excommunication upon those English clergymen who upheld the constitutions of Clarendon in 1166. Henry threatened to confiscate the property of all priories in England, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine, affiliated with the Abbey of Pontigny, if its abbot continued to harbor Becket. The frightened abbot begged Thomas to leave, and the ailing rebel lived for a time on alms in a dingy inn at Sens. Alexander III, prodded by Louis VII of France, commanded Henry to restore the archbishop to his see or face an interdict of all religious services in the territories under English rule. Henry yielded. He came to Avranches, met Becket, promised to remedy all his complaints, and held the archbishop's stirrup as the triumphant prelate mounted to return to England in 1169. Back in Canterbury, Thomas repeated his excommunication of the bishops who had opposed him. Some of these went to Henry in Normandy and roused him to fury with perhaps exaggerated accounts of Becket's behavior. "What?" exclaimed Henry. "Shall a man who has eaten my bread insult the king and all the kingdom, and not one of the lazy servants whom I nourish at my table does me right for such an affront?" 4 knights who heard him went to England, apparently without the knowledge of the king. On December 30th, 1170, they found the archbishop at the altar of the cathedral in Canterbury, and there they cut him down with their swords. All Christendom rose in horror against Henry, branding him with a spontaneous and universal excommunication. After secluding himself in his chambers and refusing food for 3 days, the king issued orders for the apprehension of the assassins, sent emissaries to the Pope to declare his innocence, and promised to perform any penance that Alexander might require. He rescinded the constitutions of Clarendon, and restored all the previous rights and property of the Church in his realm. Meanwhile, the people canonized Becket, and proclaimed that many miracles were worked at his tomb. The Church officially pronounced him a saint in 1172, and soon thousands were making pilgrimage to his shrine. Finally, Henry, too, came to Canterbury as a penitent pilgrim. All the last 3 miles he walked with bare and bleeding feet on a flinty road. He prostrated himself before the tomb of his dead foe, begged the monks to scourge him, and submitted to their blows. His strong will broke under the weight of general obloquy and mounting troubles in his realm. His wife Eleanor, banished and imprisoned by the adulterous king, plotted with her sons to depose him. His eldest son Henry led feudal rebellions against him in 1173 and 1183, and died in revolt. In 1189 his sons Richard and John, impatiently awaiting his death, allied themselves with Philip Augustus of France in war upon their father. Driven from Le Mans, he denounced the God who had taken from him this town of his birth and love, and dying at Chinon in 1189, he cursed with his last breath the sons who had betrayed him, and the life that had given him power and glory, riches and mistresses, enemies, contumely, treacheries, and defeat. He had not quite failed. He had surrendered to Becket dead what he had refused to Becket living. Yet in that bitter dispute it was Henry's contention that won the accolade of time. From reign to reign after him, the secular courts spread their jurisdiction over clerical as well as lay subjects of the king. He liberated English law from feudal and ecclesiastical limitations and set it upon the path of development that has made it one of the supreme legal achievements since imperial Rome. Like his great-grandfather, the Conqueror, he strengthened and unified the government of England by reducing to discipline and order a rebellious and anarchic nobility. There he succeeded too well. The central government became strong to the verge of irresponsible and incalculable despotism. And the next round in the historic alternation between order and liberty belonged to the aristocracy and freedom. 3. Magna Carta. Richard I the Lionheart had succeeded without challenge to his father's throne. Son of the adventurous, impulsive, irrepressible Eleanor, he followed in her steps rather than those of the somber and competent Henry. Born in Oxford in 1157, he was delegated by his mother to administer her dominions in Aquitaine. There he imbibed the skeptical culture of Provence, the gay science of the troubadours, and was never afterward an Englishman. He loved adventure and song more than politics and administration. He crowded a century of romance into his 42 years and gave to the poets of his time the compliment of imitation as well as the encouragement of patronage. The first 5 months of his reign were spent in gathering funds for a crusade. He appropriated for the purpose the full treasury left by Henry II. He removed thousands of officials and reappointed them for a consideration. He sold charters of freedom to cities that could pay, and acknowledged Scotland's independence for 15,000 marks. Not that he loved money less, but adventure more. Within half a year of his accession he was off to Palestine. He cared as little for his own safety as for others' rights. He taxed his realm to the utmost and squandered revenue in luxury, feasting, and display. But he galloped through the final decade of the 12th century with such bravado and bravery that his fellow poets ranked him above Alexander, Arthur, and Charlemagne. He fought and loved Saladin, failed and swore to conquer him, turned homeward and was captured on the way in 1192 by Duke Leopold of Austria, whom he had offended in Asia. Early in 1193, Leopold surrendered him to the Emperor Henry VI, who held a grudge against Henry II and Richard. Despite the law, generally recognized in Europe, against the detention of a crusader, Henry VI kept the King of England prisoner in a castle at Dürnstein on the Danube, and demanded for him from England a ransom of 150,000 marks, or $15 million, double the whole annual revenue of the British crown. In the meantime, Richard's brother John tried to seize the throne. Resisted, he fled to France and joined Philip Augustus in attacking England. Philip, violating a pledge of peace, attacked and seized English possessions in France and offered great bribes to Henry VI to keep Richard prisoner. Richard fretted in comfortable durance and wrote an excellent ballad appealing to his country for ransom. Through this turmoil, Eleanor governed successfully as regent, with the wise counsel of her justiciar, Hubert Walter, Archbishop of Canterbury. But they found it hard to raise the ransom. Finally released in 1194, Richard hurried to England, levied taxes and troops, and led an army across the Channel to avenge himself and Britain against Philip. Tradition holds that he refused the sacraments for years lest he be required to forgive his faithless enemy. He recovered all the territory that Philip had captured and resigned himself to a peace that allowed Philip to live. In the interlude he quarreled with a vassal, Adhemar, Viscount of Limoges, who had found a cache of gold on his land. Adhemar offered Richard a part, Richard demanded all, and besieged him. An arrow from Adhemar's castle struck the king, and Richard Coeur de Lion died in his 43rd year in a dispute over a mess of gold. His brother John, 1199 to 1216, nicknamed Lackland because, unlike his elder brothers, he had not received from his father any appanage on the continent, succeeded him after some opposition and distrust, and Archbishop Walter made him swear a coronation oath that his throne was held by the election of the nation, that is, the nobles and prelates, and the grace of God. But John, having been false to his father, his brother, and his wife, was not sorely hampered by one more vow. Like Henry II and Richard I, he gave little evidence of religious belief. It was said that he had never taken the Eucharist since coming of age, not even on his coronation day. The monks charged him with atheism and told how, having caught a fat stag, he had remarked, "How plump and well fed is this animal, and yet I dare swear he never heard Mass," which the monks resented as an allusion to their corpulence. He was a man of much intellect and little scruple, an excellent administrator, no great friend to the clergy, and therefore, said Holinshead, a bit maligned by monastic chroniclers, not always in the wrong, but often alienating men by his sharp temper and wit, his scandalous humor, his proud absolutism, and the tax exactions to which he felt driven in defending continental England against Philip Augustus. In 1199, John secured permission from Pope Innocent III to divorce Isabel of Gloucester on grounds of consanguinity, and soon thereafter he married Isabella of Angoulême, despite her betrothal to the Count of Lusignan. The nobility of both countries took offense, and the Count appealed to Philip for redress. About the same time, the barons of Anjou, Touraine, Poitou, and Maine protested to Philip that John was oppressing their provinces. By feudal fealties, going back to the cession of Normandy to Rollo, the territorial lords of France, even in provinces owned by England, acknowledged the French king as their feudal suzerain, and by feudal law John, as Duke of Normandy, was vassal to the King of France. Philip summoned his royal vassal to come to Paris and defend himself against divers charges and appeals. John refused. The French feudal court declared his possessions in France forfeited and awarded Normandy, Anjou, and Poitou to Arthur, Count of Brittany, a grandson of Henry II. Arthur laid claim to the throne of England, raised an army, and besieged at Mirabeau Queen Eleanor, who, though 80, led a force in defense of her unruly son. John rescued her, captured Arthur, and apparently ordered his death. Philip invaded Normandy. John was too busy honeymooning at Rouen to lead his troops. They were defeated, John fled to England, and Normandy, Maine, Anjou, and Touraine passed to the French crown. Pope Innocent III, at odds with Philip, had done what he could to help John. John now quarreled with Innocent. On the death of Hubert Walter in 1205, the king persuaded the older monks of Canterbury to elect John de Grey, Bishop of Norwich, to the vacant see. A group of younger monks chose Reginald, their sub-prior, as archbishop. The rival candidates hurried to Rome, seeking papal confirmation. Innocent rejected them both and appointed to the see Stephen Langton, an English prelate who for the past 25 years had lived in Paris and was now a professor of theology in the university there. John protested that Langton had no preparation for the office of primate of England, a position involving political as well as ecclesiastical functions. Ignoring John's demurrers, Innocent, at Viterbo in Italy, consecrated Stephen Archbishop of Canterbury in 1207. John defied Langton to set foot on English soil, threatened to burn the cloisters over the heads of the rebellious Canterbury monks, and swore by the teeth of God that if the Pope laid an interdict on England he would banish every Catholic clergyman from the land and would put out the eyes and cut off the nose of some of them for good measure. The interdict was pronounced in 1208. All religious services of the clergy in England were suspended except baptism and extreme unction. Churches were closed by the clergy, church bells were silenced, and the dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. John confiscated all episcopal or monastic properties and gave them to laymen. Innocent excommunicated the king. John ignored the decree and waged successful campaigns in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. The people trembled under the interdict, but the nobles acquiesced in the spoliation of church property as transiently diverting the royal appetite from their own wealth. Proud of his apparent victory, John offended many by his excesses. He neglected his second wife to beget illegitimate children upon careless mistresses, jailed Jews to milk their money from them, allowed some imprisoned prelates to die of hardships, alienated nobles by adding insults to taxes, and strictly enforced the unpopular forestry laws. In 1213, Innocent used his last resort. He promulgated a decree of deposition against the English king, released John's subjects from their oath of allegiance, and declared the king's possessions to be now the lawful spoil of whoever could wrest them from his sacrilegious hands. Philip Augustus accepted the invitation, assembled an impressive army, and marched to the Channel coast. John prepared to resist invasion, but now he discovered that the nobles would not support him in a war against a pope armed with physical as well as spiritual force. Furious against them, and seeing the imminence of defeat, he struck a bargain with Pandulf, the papal legate. If Innocent would withdraw his decrees of excommunication, interdict, and deposition, and would change from foe to friend, John pledged himself to return all confiscated ecclesiastical property, and to submit his crown and his kingdom to the pope in feudal vassalage. It was so agreed. John surrendered all England to the pope and received it back after 5 days as a papal fief subject to perpetual tribute and fealty. This in 1213. John embarked for Poitou to attack Philip and commanded the barons of England to follow him with arms and men. They refused. The victory of Philip at Bouvines deprived John of German and other allies to whom he had looked for aid against an expanding France. He returned to England to face an embittered aristocracy. The nobles resented his inordinate taxation for disastrous wars, his violations of precedent and law, his bartering of England for Innocent's forgiveness and support. To force the issue, John required of them a scutage, a money payment in lieu of military service. They sent him instead a deputation demanding a return to the laws of Henry I, which had protected the rights of the nobles and limited the powers of the king. Receiving no satisfactory answer, the nobles collected their armed forces at Stamford, and while John dallied at Oxford, they sent emissaries to London, who won the support of the Commune and the court. At Runnymede on the Thames near Windsor, the forces of the aristocracy encamped opposite the few supporters of the king. There, John made his second great surrender and signed in 1215 Magna Carta, the most famous document in English history. This book is continued on Cassette 12, Side 1.